Okay, welcome everyone to the seminar on skills and technological change, and thank you for joining this discussion on two important issues. I see we have about 50 attendees joining us, and there's 6 of us on the panel, so we have quite a good discussion, and hopefully a few more people will still be joining us. Okay, so our discussion this morning is on the issues of the future of jobs and the science, technology and innovation indicators. We are looking at these two important issues as linked discussions, and it enables us to make informed decisions on technological change issues based on evidence rather than on the hype. Both presentations are based on research undertaken and on comprehensive reports, both of which are available. And during the course of this morning, we'll share the links to both reports. Today's discussion takes place under the banner of Closing the Skills and Innovation Gap Accelerator, which is part of a global World Economic Forum program, and in South Africa is being undertaken in a partnership with us, Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, or TIPS, and government, South African government departments, which includes the dtic and Department of Science and Innovation, as well as WEF. The aim of this accelerator is to create awareness and to put the changing technological environment into context, and to ensure that as a country or as firms, we understand what is taking place globally. We are better placed to ensure that we are able to position ourselves appropriately in the technological change space. But also through this awareness creation, we don't just blindly follow the hype. And there's a lot of hype out there on these issues. All of us, government, individual firms, research institutions, universities, science councils, have an important role to play in strengthening innovation in the country. And part of our messaging is to ensure that all of us take our role seriously and we all invest in this critical area. This accelerator creates a platform for information sharing and for robust discussion, and we'll be holding several of these dialogues on different topics over the next year. For those that do not know me, my name is Saul Levin, and I'm from TIPS, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So that everyone is aware, we're recording the discussion, and it will be available on the TIPS website, as well as the presentations that we see today and the links to the report. I also encourage you to use the Q&A and group chat function in the webinar so that we can engage and have discussion along the way as well. After the two presentations, there is some time for discussions, but we are trying to keep the webinars short and focused, and so they are scheduled for an hour and a quarter, and we can go slightly long if necessary, but prefer to try and keep to our time frame. Once we've finished our discussions and presentations, I'll ask participants to raise their hands in the Zoom chat function. There's a button to raise your hand, and then we can open up for discussion that way. Now I'd like to hand over to the representative from the dtic, Ilse Karg, who's the Chief Director in the Industry Competitiveness and Growth Division of the dtic and works directly on these issues. Ilse, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. The department aims to reindustrialize the economy, and my role in the department is on 4IR and developing a digital industrial policy and strategy. Automation and digital production systems require specific sets of skills and abilities. And we see in modern manufacturing that cloud-based solutions and Internet of Things are becoming very important. And you need specific skills to be able to participate in the manufacturing sector. Specifically, technical skills and vocational training are very important. We recognize in our digital industrial policy and strategy that skills, knowledge, and technical abilities are key enablers for implementation of the policy. I think also what's very important to us is to look at interdepartmental discussions on policy alignment. It is very important to align demand of skills with the supply of skills. I think I will stop there and thank the organizers for this event, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Saul.
Thank you very much, Ilse. Okay. If we can please ask the presenters to show their cameras so that we can see you and so that you're not just a voice in the background. I know we are looking at the technology, but we are also wanting to see our presenters. Thank you very much, Ilse. Okay, so our first presenter today is Dr. Vesselina or Vessi Ratcheva, and she's from the World Economic Forum. Dr. Ratcheva is a senior data-driven researcher and analyst at the World Economic Forum, or WEF, and is working to provide timely insight and practical recommendations to industry and policy leaders in the platform for the new economy and society at the World Economic Forum. Dr. Ratcheva is co-author of the Forum's Global Gender Gap Report, Global Human Capital Report, and Future of Jobs Report, which she's going to be presenting today, and the Industry Gender Gap Report as well. And in the past, she has led and collaborated on research projects spanning topics such as skills, identity, organizational culture, political mobilization, and international migration. I would now like to hand over to Vessi to give the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning to everybody. Let me just put up some slides just to start telling you a little bit more about what we found through our Global Future of Jobs report. This was launched just a few months ago, and actually you were amongst the first organizations to get this kind of preview, specifically from the World Economic Forum. This report helps us track labor market insights that are otherwise unavailable through a lot of statistical departments. We know the labor market is moving very fast with large changes brought about by technological innovation. This is changing jobs and skills. And there is renewed urgency to find proactive measures to ease the transition of workers into this new future of work that promises to bring much prosperity in the midterm, but will require also significant adjustment in the short term. So let me share a little bit more about what we found in partnership with local organizations in South Africa, which supported our surveying specifically of South African firms, but also with a lot of research organizations globally who also allowed us to reach and get cross-country understanding of what is happening with respect to the Future of Jobs report, Future of Jobs metrics. So let's start with some basis of conversation where South Africa's human capital and labor market stands today. And this is going to be figures that everybody probably already knows. And I'm going to start, hello, you can probably see me now as well. I'm going to start by quickly touching base on some of the figures that should be reasonably familiar, but also some of those that you might not have yet seen, which are coming out of our executive opinion survey, and which rate some of the skills gaps that are less commonly covered by statistical systems. So we know that South Africa has quite a high unemployment rate, and that this is particularly there for the workers who have more basic education, so primary and secondary education, whereas for those with an advanced education, this unemployment rate is lower. It's also a country in which we see a slightly high unemployment rate for women. And as we've looked at the changes between Q2 of last year and Q2 of this year, we've seen that also that has slightly worsened in international statistics. We see there's a reasonable level of vulnerable employment as well, but that the gig economy, unlike in other economies where it actually erodes working conditions, a lot of people see it also as a positive force within the economy. And finally, we can see that the business community evaluates the skills that are imparted among the population by basic education as reasonably low rated. So you see the score of 29.9% or 30 score points, and this same figure for comparison of the business relevance of basic education in Chile is something like 50, and in Poland so like 41. So this is quite low in respect to what we usually see, and this is also there for the specific skill set that is quite important today and will continue to be quite important in the future of digital skills among the active population. Now, what is the other dimension that we now can look to understand how this might shift and evolve in the future? So you'll see on the right-hand side here of the slide, one of the questions and the answers to how are you looking to respond to the new changes happening to jobs and skills. This is to the business community, specifically within South Africa. And when we ask this question globally, we get quite a diverse set of answers, but it is quite striking that in South Africa, the first response we get is we are looking to automate the work. Some people are looking to retrain employees, but also there's a lot of interest in strategic redundancies and outsourcing. So when we look at the figures on the left of what is currently the case in the labor market, and when we look at the figures on the right, we see that some of the changes that are coming our way because of the way that the future of work is going to evolve might not be quite as positive unless they're managed in a thoughtful and meaningful way. So let's pan out a little bit and think about what is this thing, the future of work? What are we talking about? So globally, we are seeing a lot of new technologies being adopted. And those technologies are supplementing what people usually did as work. And among those technologies are cloud computing, big data analytics, the Internet of Things, encryption, artificial intelligence. We've all heard the various projections. This gives specific figures to what business leaders are actually looking to adopt. And we see that also in particular countries, this is more nuanced. So depending on the country, the business community is looking to actually adopt different technologies, and the main ones remain the same, but there's perhaps a different mix. What does that mean? So that means that the balance of work between humans and machines is changing. We expect that by 2025, the amount of work hours spent by a human and machine in the labor market is going to be roughly the same. And that means that there is going to be this augmentation of work. And for some companies, that means automation. So actually displacing humans. For some companies, that means more augmentation. We can see that globally, the acceleration of augmentation by specifically the COVID trends is predicted to be something that most companies are going to be looking to for about 50% of companies, so half-half. In South Africa, this figure is at 75%, so a little bit higher. And also we see that some of the other trends that have been accelerated by COVID-19 in the current context we find ourselves, which is really dovetailing with this overall trend of the arrival of the future of work, are going to be also slightly different in the South Africa context than in the global context. So here we've seen a large expansion of the availability of remote work in a lot of economies. So 83% of businesses globally tell us they're looking to scale remote work. In South Africa, that figure is a little bit lower at 63%. And then we have digitization, which is different from automation. Digitization is just the use of digital technologies at work. And there, 84% of companies are really looking to scale digitization. In South Africa, that figure is getting lower, 63%. So we see a distinctive footprint in South Africa, what is happening in the context of COVID-19, but also in the context of the future of jobs. That we see as a much larger focus on automation and much lower focus, perhaps today, on the scaling of remote work and actually adopting the digitization within the workplace. So just quickly to touch base, what does this automation mean? So for most of us that have been following this debate, the automation really means that we are seeing machines being able to do some tasks better than humans, more faster, or in a slightly more safe way. So it depends really on the technology, but we're seeing that this also affects both white collar and blue collar professions. So if you look at the specific tasks that are listed above on this slide, you see that information and data processing is amongst the tasks that is going to be most encouraged upon by technology. And that actually means accounting, that actually means some parts of journalism, that actually means some parts of office work. But we also know that on the other end, we have other kinds of automation, like non-humanoid robots used in mining. So this is really quite a rich picture of how you can leverage the new technologies that are around us to really change the way we work. In the long term and midterm, we expect that this will probably net out to a positive to workers everywhere, but the mix of jobs is going to change. So you see here that there are a set of jobs that are decreasing in demand and growing in demand. Those decreasing in demand are really that mix of very manual work that is very repetitive, and also of quite usually skilled work, but also still repetitive work that until now often served as a kind of midway point into the high level professions, a step in the ladder, so to say, that is now going away. But we do have a growth in a lot of other jobs. And we do think that having looked at the data and having read across this literature and having heard the evidence, this is going to be in the mid and long term a really good story for a lot of people. But those jobs are very different. So whereas data entry clerks, so processing data in quite a manual way, is going away, we need data analysts and scientists. And there is a skill step change that goes with this. And that skill step change means that 50% of all employees are likely to need some reskilling by 2025. And if you look at the average workers, about 40% of skill sets will change. And this is actually both workers who are staying in their jobs most likely, and workers who will most likely be displaced. And what does that mean? It means that no matter what job you do, it's very likely that what you need to perform as a task on a day-to-day basis, and therefore the skills you need, is going to be reasonably different. And if we can go back a little bit, what we're seeing is also it's not only one kind of skill set that will be the one that brings forward prosperity. It is also a mix of both human and very technical skills. So we tend to hear all the stories of let's actually just make more developers. Yes, we do need developers. There is a need for data and AI, but there's also a need for salespeople, for people in culture representatives who will help make sure you have the right talent in an organization. You also need content producers to market content, to produce and shape it, to present it to an audience. So this is really a rich picture. It is not just the technology only picture. And when we look at the top 10 skills that will be needed in the horizon up to 2025, we also see an increasing emphasis on the kinds of complex thinking skills that is distinctively human. So complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, these are all amongst the top skills of the future. And this has held very constant for the past 5 decades in which we've conducted this survey and produced this analysis. So what is the solution space here? We know that there's going to need to be some training if we're going to be able to switch the current workforce into this new modality. And on average, business leaders across the globe believe this is training that will eventually return on investment. So within a year, 2 out of 3 business leaders tell us that they'll receive a return on investment. And for this report, we also partnered with Coursera, which gave us a lot of granular insight on how fast can you actually start learning some of these new skill sets. So if you think of the kinds of jobs that you saw on the screen a few moments ago, we know that for some of them, you can actually start picking up skills within 1 to 2 months of online training. So as long as you have access to digital technologies, you actually will be able to start actually making a learning plan and start picking up the skills that are necessary. Some others require much longer term investment. And this is where we know that in some contexts, governments will distinctly need to step in order to make sure that this investment will be made evenly for both the short-term and long-term horizon. And globally, we see that 21% of businesses reported being able to make use of public funds to support employee reskilling and upskilling. And actually, a lot of mid-career reskilling and upskilling is happening within organizations. And this is a bit of a step change, because in the past modality of skilling, we had a very strong investment in skilling and education in the first half of a person's life, or first quarter of a person's life. And then within the workplace, people mostly learned informally. However, the acceleration of these changes mean that we need fully new systems to infuse skills into mid-career trajectories. And this is the kinds of investments that both the business and public sector communities will need to consider quite carefully. As well as actually making those changes to the way that reskilling is provided, there's a need to also support workers in their actual redeployment. So overall, we know that some workers will be displaced very much kind of today as a result of also the current COVID-19 context, but also because their jobs are slowly less and less viable. And there are opportunities on the other end that can be created and that are already emerging. But in order to seize those opportunities, workers both need retraining and the support system to transition to those new opportunities. Today, it's quite often the case that recruitment is done on what worked in the past, on existing formula. Those need to be reset and new pathways need to be put in place. What you can see on the left is kind of the organic movements of people from one set of job families, so professional clusters, to those new professional clusters that we identified in the past. We mapped this together with the LinkedIn Economic Graph team, or one of the data partners with whom we work. And you actually see that people transition into these new professions quite organically. And in many cases, when they transition, they don't have the full skill set. And when those professions are quite new, when those jobs are quite new, there's a lot of opportunity to forge this new path. But the support system really does need to be there, especially when we're talking about workers who are probably coming from a lower educational background and might need to imagine themselves in a new role, a new profession. So what is the context right now for South Africa on the basis of our survey? What might be the skills mix needed? So what we can see is there's actually declining opportunity, as I mentioned before, in keeping with overall trends in roles such as accounting, bookkeeping, and payroll clerks. And this can be quite stressing if you think of all those professionals who thought, okay, I'll become an accountant and it will all be fine because this is a very, very steady profession that has always had work. But we see that's going away. Client information and customer service workers, there is automation of this related to kind of new voice technologies and chatbots and a whole load of other tech. So what is going to happen to the people who are currently in these roles? We see that there is a gap to the professions above, which include professions such as process automation specialists, big data specialists. And we also see that assembly and factory workers are in both lists. And it's quite like, why in both lists? But the reality is the skill set for the job on the bottom end of this graph that is redundant is going to be different from the skill set of the job that is at the top end of the graph that is emerging. What the assembly and factory workers who are growing demand will need to do will be those tasks that are in tandem with the automation in that assembly line. So what is the expected reskilling need? Well, the good news is, according to the survey, about 16% of workers need reskilling of less than a month. So that should be doable. That should be possible. We just need to know what are the growing jobs, what are the new skill sets, and that could be a very quickly implemented new transition. But then about 16% of people need reskilling of over 1 year. And this is where we kind of remember that figure that typically the return on investment is seen to be pretty much within a year for businesses. And it's quite a standard business cycle. So when we look then to the right and we see that the use of training providers by businesses is going to be primarily the use of internal learning and development and some external online learning. And only about 7.3% of businesses are telling us that they'll be using the public training and education services. This is why it becomes concerning. So how is the funding of these internal business structures going to work so that it can actually reach those individuals who need 1 year or more of reskilling? And this is why how we can contextualize the first figures we saw, which are telling us, well, there's quite a significant appetite right now in the context that in response to these coming disruptions, we'll be seeing a significant amount of automation and looking for external talent pools. But what we've actually seen over time in this future of jobs context is that there is, of course, not an infinite amount of talent. When you don't reskill people, it's not that you can actually find the ready talent for those new professions out in the labor market. So I would like to kind of also finish on reflecting on the global picture. So we're picking here the global mining and metals industry and seeing where this is and what is likely to come also from this very key sectors for South Africa. So we see that about 20% of workers are at risk of displacement. We see that there's an increasing need for technology use skills. We see that there's also an increasing interest in non-humanoid robots, so the kind of mining robots that you often see. But we also see that the barriers to businesses adopting technologies is skills in the local labor market and the inability to attract specialized talent. So I think the bigger question, the inflection question for all economies ends up being, how do you build the skills set in the local labor market? And this is where I'd like to pause and kind of open it up to questions and hand over to my colleagues in the panel.
Thanks very much. Before we move on to Mlungisi's presentation, let's take one or two questions that seem to have come through on the Q&A. So the first one is, and I think, sorry, let's start with one on the chat because it speaks directly to the last comment that Vessi was making and saying, and it's a question from Michael Lawrence. Hi, Michael. He's saying, should governments not be offering extravagant tax deductions or equivalent for training in 4IR tagged skills, especially in times of COVID? How would you respond to that, Vessi?
Well, this sounds like one of a range of possible instruments where we often see a need for collaboration between the public and private sector is in making sure there's the infrastructure to train individuals. It depends from business to business, whether there is a chief learning officer, whether there is an established practice of creating curricula that are meaningful. In many cases, the benefits of governments supporting this part of the content mapping has been to be able to actually create a meaningful curricula that can be implemented in different parts of the economy quite fast. But this is amongst the things that I know Attilio has also been looking at in various other economies. So I will also leave the floor to him if he wants to step in and discuss it.
Attilio?
Thanks, Vessi. No, I think it's very much like you said. I think the role of government can be really a 360 360 role. I mean, it's beyond just the tax deduction. I think also both designing the curricula, but also trying to make sure that there is enough quality training services in the country. That's something also that we've seen in countries like Singapore. That's also really within the realm of the government. I think it's really creating a bit of an ecosystem for retraining the workers. So both in terms of stimulating the demand for retraining through tax deductions and other schemes like those, but also making sure that there is enough supply of these good quality training services. And like Bessie said, the curricula are actually fit for purpose. So it's really beyond just the deductions and tax and fiscal incentives. That would be my take on this. Thanks.
Thanks. And then the other two questions, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. But very briefly, I mean, you've already spoken to some of these things, saying it's not only very high-skilled people, but do you want to just respond to the question from Soraya that says, many of the skills professions being discussed seem to be high-skilled. What kind of skills and opportunities are required for entry-level jobs of the future? And then a related question from Fiona is saying, what role does experience play in retraining, building skill sets to include giving people the opportunity to apply these skills? Thanks.
So I think a lot of those professions can be done at both a lower skilled and a higher skilled level. And there is what the government of Singapore and others have done quite well is to define what that ladder looks like. So to actually identify what are the lower end of the skills and what are higher end of the skills, and how can you walk an employee from that lower to higher end. And this also gives us a clue about how you start transitioning people who maybe have very low educational background right now into professions that at first hand seem like it can be quite daunting. And some of the best initiatives out there that have done this have looked at what are the easy win professions that can be done at a reasonably low skilled level with people who've had maybe a micro credential that can give them a good start in that profession. And then with time, you can actually grow the ambition level through additional micro credentials and other certifications. But you need to be quite mindful of what that trajectory could be. And this is where the best policy initiatives have done that actual planning of what is the ladder? How do you transition people from junior to top positions? Because the real insight right now is that the middle is falling out. And the problem then is, how do you actually get people from the low to the high end? How do you make sure you don't have a highly polarized society, or that you don't continue having a highly polarized society?
Okay, thanks very much, Bessie. We're going to now move on to the next presentation from Mlungisi. He is the acting head for the National Advisory Council on Innovation, or NACI, and is an official in the Department of Science and Innovation. Dr. Cele holds a PhD in Higher Education Studies from the University of Western Cape and an MPhil in Science and Technology Studies from Stellenbosch University. He joined the Department of Science and Innovation in 2005. Back then it was called DST. And has been involved in various assignments related to science, technology and innovation policy, human capital development, and strategy and planning and reviews. Prior to joining the DSI, he worked as a researcher at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and at the University of Western Cape. Thank you. Let me hand over to Mlungisi, and looking forward to your presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. The task that we are asked to do this morning is to share what we consider to be the STI indicators report, which is essentially a report that provides some statistics and assessment of national system of innovation, of course, within a global context. As you would be receiving this presentation, just keep in mind the data challenge that we are experiencing as a country. And then, of course, the context in which the report evolved is important. And that is of, the COVID pandemic, which has implications on a range of areas. And some, they call it, that it has resulted in economic crisis, ecological crisis, as well as it has deepened some social challenges that are facing South Africa. So the report itself, it highlights both the opportunities and challenges, for instance, in the areas of knowledge production, knowledge exploitation and utilization, investment, and human resources. It's important to stress that by placing STI at the center of South Africa's development agenda, we have an opportunity to ensure that the country becomes a global center of STI. It is an important statement that we seeking about the work that needs to be done. To a great extent by the well, just quickly so that we allow colleagues to engage. The findings of the report, they vary with some things. Has our position we go on, and competitive index, it is showing a similar trend that in various system is to show it's really and the nation. One of the positives sign has somewhat in the previous comparison or previous report, as you know, we move from the average of income the business and the higher education increased at 14.7 and 15.7 respectively between 2016 and 17.7 and 15 point between of terms of the female work constant, and then again when you disaggregate you could see that if you look at where we were 27, some progress. For instance, if you look at the African staff complement, there is some progress. Okay, so again, if you look at the doctoral research, the area that will attention and when you look at the entire cohort of engineering across levels and you could be the chance. Then again, if you break that in terms of race, again you could see the dynamics that are at play. In respect of STI investment or funding, our target of 1.5% by which should have been realized last year, we are And this is a story that most South Africans are quite familiar with. But what is of concern, at least to us, is in respect of business investment in R&D as a percentage of GDP. And we have called on our stakeholders, on our partners, to do a detailed analysis as to why this trend continue to go down, because Japan arrested. Given the, but we believe that it would better. Look, the NRF research grants, just as an example, the trend. And of course, you could only imagine what implications would this have in terms of our ability to generate a new cadre of intellectuals, as well as the generation of knowledge. The report also looked, or attempted to look at, the provincial innovation systems. And you could see the provinces that are investing more on R&D, and it's not surprising that Gauteng, KZN, and the Western Cape, they could positive trend towards this this indicator. Issues, colleagues, not surprising. One data that South Africa some the trends there to start thinking about it and what needs to happen. Because the issue around technology outputs, this is the concern, that we remain challenged in terms of the extent to which we're able to translate research results into patents and commercializable products. It's really a challenge, or an area of inefficiency that is facing our system. And this slide simply shows the extent to which the private sector utilizes information from public institutions. And it's not really a good picture. And those who are spending time analyzing academia industry partnerships or government partnerships need to pay attention to as to what is it that is making it difficult for the private sector not to utilize as much information as they should from the public sector. And then, of course, on technology exports, South Africa has a low share of high-tech exports as a percentage of manufactured exports, comparatively speaking. But again, this is an area that we all need to pay attention and think about it. Now, the area around technology balance of payments, it's part of the area to try and get a better handle. Because people differ about how to interpret the results of technology balance of payments. But this is the story and this slide simply shows you the various innovation guys. Graduate unemployment is not a major issue compared to general unemployment, but nevertheless, if you look at the information provided, the people, they constitute the majority of those who are unemployed. And then, of course, that small percentage of graduates. But the question remains about the extent to which COVID may impact on this indicator and the wherever you may land I indicated that challenge, as some of us may be aware, that it's been really responsive towards COVID. And we can talk about a range of other interventions that have emerged from the system, including the National Ventilator Program and so forth. So then the question would be, is there sufficient robustness to have an STI-driven post-COVID recovery going forward? And that's the question that the system needs. The two indicators, Gert and Bert, I cause for and the question is, what lessons can we draw from the 2008 crisis to help us address some of the challenges and the discussion between TBP and trade balance and their potential contribution to economic growth. And then, of course, serious effort is required to secure demographic dividend. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thanks very much. We lost some of your sound every now and again, but we still managed to get the strong sense of what the report is, and it points to some deficiencies that need to be addressed, but also points to some areas where we have some strengths and some opportunities. And what we're going to do now is then open up for questions and discussions. So we'll do it in two ways. We can ask people to both raise their hand within the Zoom function, and then we can we'll unmute you and then give you an opportunity to ask your question and engage. And then there's also several questions that have come through on the Q&A as well as the chat. And I think let's pick up some of them relate to both the first presentation and Mlungisi's presentation on the STI indicators. So I think the first question is that we get to after the earlier ones is from Jean-Jacques, who asks, how would the trends be different between developed and developing countries? I don't know if it doesn't have to only be Vessi, it can be some of the other panelists if you want to talk to that. Ilse has also been looking at those issues within the BRICS context, and Ilse, you're also welcome to step in and answer some of those questions. And I think Attilio, you've also had some dealings on those issues. So we'll start, and Mlungisi, you're welcome to chip in at any point, even if the question isn't directly related to your specific presentation, but it's all related and linked, I think. And so we'd welcome to have your insights as well on some of these Q&As. Let's start with Vessi, and then other people can come in.
Thank you. So a few marked differences. One is that we still see a significant digital access gap across many developing economies, which is then associated with a gap in digital skills. So I think that does put some developing economies at a disadvantage to begin with, which does need to be closed perhaps in different ways. The other dimension is the kind of educational gaps that we see. So we also have, as you know, our global competitiveness report, and what we've seen there over the years is the basic standard of education everywhere has actually gradually increased. But of course, there is still a gap between developing and developed economies. And so that's another aspect where with these quite high skilled in some cases roles, it is important to make sure that there are accessible training pathways, no matter what education systems, how education systems performed in the past. However, what is actually a positive is because populations are quite young in developing economies, it does mean that there's an opportunity to quickly and quite decisively address those education gaps, and that will have a much more significant footprint than in a lot of advanced economies, where we're really talking about making investments to people's careers in very kind of in mid-career and late life, and that investment does kind of seem sometimes misplaced for some professionals, and there are also positives to this whole conversation.
Any of the other panelists want to come in on that issue? Okay, I think we've seen in the chat group that Alistair has posted a related issue and saying it's not just the training we need to think about for individuals who are in the workplace or retraining, but it's also around entrepreneurs. So we might have people already in business, but there's some gaps in the way they understand what they're doing, and they need the exposure to cutting edge skills and how to, I suppose, run their businesses differently because of these changes that are happening. And so that means that the type of training we need to be thinking about is not just for workers. It's about people who are running companies who may not be able to get exposed to all of the things that they are required to through just self-learning or going onto a website and trying to figure these things out. There does need to be some thought to curriculum around entrepreneurs who can then move their businesses along these lines. I don't know what the panel's views on some of that, and that also I think points to a lot of what Mlungisi was saying, because it's firms who invest in the science and innovation, but where do they start? And we've often seen, even especially in corporates, there's been a cutting back on that type of investment, rather as the active shareholder movement has taken root. We've seen some of these research and innovation units actively being taken out of big corporates and shifted to the public sector. So it's not only small firms that requires that kind of investment. Are we also thinking about the bigger firms in that space? Panel?
Maybe I can go first. I think if we look at skills development, it shouldn't be seen in isolation of other things that we need to catch up with as a developing country. We need to look at the ecosystem where skills play a very important role, but there are many other things that we are trying to address at the same time. So government departments are racing to adjust their policies and strategies, but also with COVID. So it's all this influences into policy and strategy that governments are facing, and we are trying to update our policies to align to that. So the digital transformation is very important, and I think that's very high on our agenda as government, to look at partnerships with business and with communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilse. Attilio?
Yeah, maybe a few words on I think it's really true. Sometimes we focus exclusively on the skills of the workers. Sometimes we forget actually the whole entrepreneurship piece, and how firms are run, and the skills of the entrepreneurs, and more broadly, maybe the governance of companies, of how they're actually. So I think it's interesting that with the Accelerator, we're trying to also bridge the two and have both the skills and innovation angle, which I think should also include a little bit of a piece on how our companies run in South Africa. What are the governance structures that maybe are not allowing that type of transition? I think whenever a country moves from more emerging developing state to our advanced state, there is both, we tend to think about the structural transformation of the economy in terms of sectors, but I think there is also a transformation within companies, that they need to be more professionalized, more well-run in terms of how they're managed in a very meritocratic way, scale up also in terms of the size of the formalization of the economy. I think that's something that needs to go in parallel, and it's across all sectors. I think that's something very interesting to always keep in mind, I think, in this type of conversation. So very well raised.
Thanks. Any of the other panelists want to comment on that discussion? Okay, let's move on to the next one. I think we've seen, and this is the next question from Mpho, is, I suppose, very specific to South Africa, and is asking, is our educational system aligned to the challenges in the economy, particularly from basic education level all the way through to the tertiary level? And I suppose that flags an interesting point, because if we don't starting, from 5 or 6 years old, are we going to get the right quality of people at the tertiary level? Because these are not just skills you acquire at the end of your training. Although, someone like me, I still have to acquire the skills. But it's something that we need to, do we say, or maybe it's too late for me, but is it, for people who are young, how do we think about the education system from the get-go, that it's geared in a very different way? Because we're teaching in a very old style, and I suppose the schools are trying to equip the young people where they can and where they have the resources. Some schools are better equipped than others, particularly in the South African context. But we also see that the curriculum is very similar. How are other countries completely overhauling their curriculum to cater for what they see as future skills requirements in their economies? Or are they saying, okay, let's just put it as an add-on, and then at the end of your basic schooling, then you can acquire the right skills? What are other countries doing, and are there any commentaries on what's happening in South Africa?
So maybe I can start on this one. So we have to really differentiate between primary and the lower end of secondary, and also pre-primary, and the upper end of secondary and tertiary education. So the kinds of skills that you saw on the slide I shared, like creativity, like critical thinking, like analytical thinking, those can start to be seeded from the start of a school career. And a lot of the discussion there will be around how much your education system depends on rote learning and how much it nurtures those skills from early on, so that children are raised into adults who can be quite adaptable and who depend on an environment where they don't just have to obey a kind of a working structure, but where they have to interact with it. So we're seeing a global rise in flat hierarchies. We're seeing that more and more people have to be quite agentative in their roles, and that roles very rarely have a clear footprint of how you actually do this. And you need to actually be able to respond to an environment that is constantly adapting. And that entrepreneurial spirit that is also necessary when you're an innovator with the fresh company is also actually needed by most employees today. So that is something that is a challenge for most education systems. Some are further ahead in trying to update, and there are a lot of international efforts in trying to define what is the way to actually teach these skills. And we're in conversations with the OECD, who have a very good program on trying to define those skills of the future and how they can be taught. So that is one dimension. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the kind of upper secondary and tertiary education. And again, everybody is in the same position here. Education systems globally are gradually becoming out of date with the requirements of the modern labor market. And what we've constantly seen is the need to have that dynamic conversation between businesses and universities, and also to understand that universities are not only for creating employees, but also can nurture innovation. But at the same time, that connection between the skill set that is needed in a vocational education degree or in a tertiary education degree, and what industry needs today, what the skills coming up are, is a bit broken everywhere. And that needs a lot more innovation. It needs a lot more conversation.
Saul?
Yes, Mlungisi, go for it.
Yes, can I make just 3 points? I think just building on what colleagues have said. The first thing in this country is just to encourage people to have this long the concept of long learning, you know, looking at education from birth to grave or cradle to grave. You know, if we can conceptualize our education system in that fashion, in that interconnectedness, you know, you then realize that what we need to do from, you know, your grade double naught is to begin to inculcate the type of skills that are being identified as important for the future. So in other words, don't wait until kids are at primary or secondary before you can introduce them to roboting skills, you know. So we understand the basic education department has a program that it's rolling out, but we know the inequalities in our society, that in certain poorer schools, there are issues around Wi-Fi connectivity and infrastructure. But we need to be working towards making sure that we seize the opportunities presented by digitalization as a way of equalizing the opportunities throughout the system. But secondly, we need to, it's much more fundamental question about the teacher training development, that in as much as we are able to identify potentially what skills will be required in the future, whether it's critical thinking, problem solving, but the reality is that we do not know precisely what type of skills would be required. So how do you then train teachers to develop kids for the future that is not easily defined? You know, it's a fundamental question that teacher training colleges or institutions need to answer so that we're able to better prepare our system. Thirdly, I think it's important to have to take advantage of some developments that have recently happened. For instance, the reconfiguration of two departments, higher education and training, as well as science and technology. Bringing these two departments together, the question is, what does that mean? How will it help us to advance the type of skills and capabilities that South Africa would require going forward? I think that's an opportunity. It needs to be seized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think those are both very, very important issues, because one of the things that we're seeing, and I think, Vessi, you raised it, is that if we don't have access to the digital technologies, it doesn't mean that we should not be changing our curriculum to say, how do we teach the right skills so that people can, you know, get access to the digital technologies when they, you know, move into the world of work, but they've got the critical thinking skills, or they've got the core skills that enables them to move into different careers a lot easier than if they were just taught by rote or in a parrot fashion. So that's really, I think, very interesting and useful for us to be thinking about. Let me then move on to the next question. We still have about 5 or so minutes. So we'll try to get through as many of these questions as possible. And it's a question from David Walwayne. David, hi, haven't seen you on the train for a while. And he's saying, I'm interested in table B of figure 27 in the main report from WEF, and the table lists the top 15 skills for 2025. From the top, analytical thinking and innovation, active learning, learning strategies, etc. How would we teach these skills at the various level? And I think it's related to what we've just been discussing, but how do we then you know, start to bring in these changes? And I suppose it's building on what we've just been saying, but you know, what does it mean, you know, in terms of his last point is the proposal from companies surveyed to scrap disciplines and replace them with new subjects. So how do we think about specifically, you know, translating those kind of skills into the workplace? And, you know, Attilio has just sent through a link, which I think does provide some insights, but maybe it's building on that discussion if any of the panelists have any further insights on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I can start on just trying to contextualize an example. Like, think about the kinds of tasks you might give a student. Let's say you've been teaching them an area of work for a while, and you give them a question and they have to write an essay. And in one view of the education system, what is expected is an essay back that cites pretty exactly what is said in a couple of key texts, often of the texts that are provided by the educator. In another version of that answer, a student is also expected to have read, in addition to those readings, to have engaged critically with the question. And if they actually disagree with the key assumptions of what has been taught to them, already that maps out some of those structural changes that need to happen to education systems. So I encourage everybody to have a look at that. But I wanted to share this one example because it can be quite mystified. What does it mean to actually encourage creativity, critical thinking, engaging with questions? But it really does require a whole set of step changes in how we engage with learners. And yes, that is from teachers, but also it will pose a range of challenges to employers when they have employees who don't necessarily respond in quite the same way to instruction or to the working environment. And that has both significant positives, but it also requires what Attilio mentioned earlier, which is a change in managerial practice. And both need to evolve this at the same time. But there is a larger and larger literature on pedagogy specifically to nurture this, and also to how to structure education systems to nurture this. So it's a very big question.
Any of the other panelists want to add to that? Okay, then let's move then to we've probably got just time for one more question. There are a number of issues that have been put out here, but let's just take one last one. And I think I'll take the one from Tebogo, who's noting the importance of science councils and the work that's been done by CSIR. I think it's just the links, I suppose, between these institutions and the corporate sector, and how do we think about those links and the role that they play in supporting, I suppose it goes more into what Mlungisi is talking about, into supporting the innovation that we require. Mlungisi or Ilse, you've both been working on those issues. How do you see the links between science councils, the businesses that are out there, and how do we start fostering those links to support strengthening the STI environment, because those are really, really key.
No, thank you very much for the question. I think it's very relevant. What we have been doing is working with Department of Higher Education and the qualification framework and accreditation framework to identify new areas where curriculum changes are needed. And so I think the way in which the development took place in the past changed now, where we created a platform to invite industry people into the process of curriculum development, where industry were able to make contributions in terms of what is needed so that the curriculums are aligned to the industry needs. So I think it's a new development that's very positive, and we will see good results of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilse. Mlungisi, any last remarks or comments on that?
Thank you very much. I think it's an important point that my colleagues who are working in the science councils would really appreciate that kind of engagement with the private sector. CSIR in particular has developed a new strategy which seeks to deepen its closer relationship with the private sector. And I will encourage everyone to go to the CSIR website and read that strategy, because it's really around making sure that CSIR uses its technological capabilities to contribute towards the industrialization of South Africa. And it's got different segments. And what CSIR has been able to do during COVID is just an illustration of both the capacity that exists within the CSR itself, but also in general in the system, working with different institutions. And the issue around private sector involvement in innovation institutions, it remains a concern, but there are various initiatives, whether you talk about TIA, CSIR, or any other institutions. SANSA, for instance, has recently received almost 4 billion rands from government infrastructure program, and it provides opportunities for future partnerships with the private sector. So I would really encourage colleagues, especially with CSIR, to go and familiarize themselves with the industrial strategy that they are pursuing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great linkage and synergy that we could get going. There's also been some other recommendations and suggestions put into the Q&A and the chat on building repositories of information and a way to try and start getting things going in South Africa. And on that note, let me hand over to Attilio, who's from the World Economic Forum. We've already heard a few comments from him on the panel, but he's leading the Accelerator program, the Country Accelerator program in WEF. And I think what we're trying to do here is to start having those conversations and building those linkages. Attilio?
Thanks, Saul. Yeah, so I think this is really, so first of all, thank you very much, TIPS, for organizing this, and of course DTIC and all of you to actually have participated today. I think this for us is really a starting point to actually have a longer set of conversations with the private sector and with the public sector in South Africa to narrow down a few activities that we would like to conduct over the next couple of years. As Saul quickly explained, the Accelerator works as a platform for collaboration between the public and the private sector around reskilling and innovation in the case of South Africa. So for us, we really look forward to continue this work also next year, over 2021. We will come back to all of you to try to actually engage you more in hearing what your thoughts are and also how we can work together. Both when it comes to reskilling and driving innovation, I think it's really about building the right type of public-private partnerships. We cannot just rely on one of the two sides to actually drive action, successful action in these type of ecosystems. And that's what we are trying to do. We have this model in a number of countries. There are more than 10 countries that are already doing Closing the Skills Gap Accelerator, and 3 other countries that are working on innovation. So we do hope that also this global expertise will be useful for South Africa. We create some opportunities for exchange. And of course, we also publish very regularly a number of insights that we have been sharing in the chat function. So I'd also do encourage you to follow us and follow some of these insights. Last month, we just published, of course, the Future of Jobs report, but also the dashboard for the new economy that looks at what are the key targets that we should be targeting as a society beyond GDP, and also the markets of tomorrow that I've shared in the chat. That would also be useful for the work of the Accelerator in terms of looking at what are the type of new markets that we want to create for the future of our economy. So what are the type of new sectors that can both drive growth and build a more inclusive and sustainable society. So really look forward to working with all of you more in the next months. And thanks very much again for the workshop today.
Good. Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists and speakers who've joined us today, and thank you for all the questions and comments that we received from everyone who joined in. I thought it was an excellent session, and we're looking forward to hosting more of these sessions over the next few months and having more of a conversation around where all of this is going. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Keep well. Bye.